Very good morning, everybody. Daba Namona, morning true. Welcome to the latest online business briefing from Business Advantage PNG, PNG's top-ranked business magazine. My name is Andrew Wilkins. I'm the Publishing Director at Business Advantage International, and I'm your moderator for this morning's PNG Infrastructure Update. Welcome no matter where you are. We have viewers this morning from all over Papua New Guinea and right across the Asia-Pacific region, all the way to the United States. Before we start, I'd like to thank Westpac in Papua New Guinea, who are sponsoring this morning's event. This is enabling us to bring it to you free of charge. So our sincere thanks to them. Before we start, three things. First of all, a plug for something completely new, which we've just launched in PNG. PNG Now is a new consumer lifestyle magazine for PNG launched this week. So look out for it if you're in Papua New Guinea, in cafes, hotels, restaurants and other social hubs. That we'll put a link into the digital edition in the chat section of this conference in a second or two. Two notes also for people attending. There's a link, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on this tab to pose a question to our speakers this morning, and we welcome all questions from you. Finally, this session is being recorded, and we will be sending you a link to an edited version by email afterwards, together with any slides. Now, on to the topic for the next hour. There's no question that PNG badly needs investment in its infrastructure. More better roads to bring agricultural produce to market, electricity to drive industrialisation and rural development, improved ports, airports, and more reliable and sophisticated telecommunications. PNG has its plans, such as the ambitious Connect PNG programme, but how does it pay for all of this? With its national budget severely constrained, PNG's government is looking to its international development partners to support its infrastructure development. We have two of the biggest of those partners with us this morning, one very established and one very new. In about 25 minutes' time, we'll hear from David Hill. He's the PNG Country Director for the Asian Development Bank, about how the bank is supporting PNG's infrastructure. He'll include an update on several projects that are already underway. But first, I'm delighted to welcome two senior representatives from the Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility for the Pacific, the recently created $2 billion Australian fund set up as a part of Australia's Pacific Step-Up policy to support infrastructure development in our region. With us are its head, Benedict David, and its Chief Investment Officer, Rob Jauncey. Welcome this morning, gentlemen.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to see you, and good to see and be able to talk to your colleagues online.
Excellent. Well, with that, what I might do is hand over to you. The stage is yours, sir.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. So my name's Benedict David. I work for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I'm responsible for our infrastructure program across the Pacific, and I'm joined by our Chief Investment Officer, Rob Jauncey, who's got substantive experience in infrastructure financing and project delivery globally across the Pacific. So it's great to be here and to be part of the conversation. What we thought we would do is give you a short overview of the AIFF, the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility Pacific, talk through the current state of play and open up questions. I'll kick off. So many of you would know and have heard of us. We're 12 months into this year. It's a $2 billion fund targeting infrastructure, critical infrastructure for the Pacific land. This is a new mechanism for the Australian government, and I think it very much responds to requests that we've had over time from Pacific nations to provide a range of tools for infrastructure development region. It's So the way we're structured is essentially we provide, we have 500 million in finance in funding that we can apply to critical infrastructure across the region. We've built in the last few months, the last 12 months, a key multidisciplinary team of development specialists, of private and sovereign finance specialists, of program managers, and foreign affairs specialists to deliver the fund. We have been working on a really substantive pipeline, and Rob will talk a little bit more to the nature of that pipeline. But in short, we're focusing and working very much on critical economic infrastructure, so power, telecommunications, transport, water projects. As I mentioned, we provide both sovereign and commercial private finance as well, so we can cover both sectors. Just a heads up, we have the way we work. For many of you that know us, know the Australian government, we use our sort of traditional aid, ODA program funding mechanisms, but we also work hand in glove with Export Finance Australia for our loan capability. So EFA, as it's called, is our back office function for our lending. So you have an appreciation of that. We're very cognizant, of course, of the impacts of COVID, and we might talk a little bit to you about how we're adjusting our operation. Before I do that, we do have a couple of projects that we are able to talk to now. They've gone through our approval process. There are many more in our pipeline. To give you a flavour, we have board approval for our investment in Markham Valley Solar. Many of your listeners today will know about the region in Papua New Guinea. That is part of the broader commitments to the PNG Electrification Partnership that was agreed in 2018. So we're investing there in a large-scale solar farm, and also recent approval of finance for the Tina River transmission line project as part of the Tina River hydropower site in Honiara, Solomon Islands. So this just give you a flavour that we're moving ahead with approvals and going into sort of the project finalisation of the finance and implementation phase. Again, I'll get Rob to talk a bit more to the pipeline and the shape of that and the size of that. I will quickly talk to some of the impacts of COVID and what we're thinking there. So, as many of you would know and be experiencing, the impact of COVID is not just on health, but is really impacting on economies, on business, on supply chains, and we're very cognizant of that. What we're looking at in terms of the approach of the fund is to really emphasise local content, local projects that drive local employment. For example, in transport, road maintenance, for example, where we can provide quick turnaround finance for projects that drive and maximise local contractors and local employment, as I've mentioned. So fast dispersing projects that create jobs locally, focus on local procurement outcomes that work for PNG, and incorporating last mile investments. So where we go from the sort of big nation building economic infrastructure, but ensuring that leads to services on the ground to the people in need. In terms of how we work, we are very much around aligning to the priorities of government and also responding to the needs of the private sector. So it's the project selection, investment selection is not done in isolation. It is done very much as part of a partnership with government and corporate and private sector. What we do is we go through a process where we jointly assess. We have an independent board which approves our project investment, and then it goes through a joint approval processes with our counterparts, for example, in Papua New Guinea, and within our own government through to conclusion. My final point is we've just established, or in the process of establishing, some key project delivery panels. They will be published shortly. Many of you would have been aware of that tender process, and what that allows us to do is to provide a range of expert commercial entities to basically provide pre-project preparation services, as well as delivery of key capex projects. So that will be on offer as well to the countries who are taking sovereign loans, and certainly we'll be happy to share further details publicly once we finalise those in the next few weeks. So I'll pass over to Rob to give you a bit more detail on our approach to our pipeline, the shape and size of that. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks all. Look, I think as Ben mentioned, unlike Australia's current aid program, AFP is primarily a lending facility, and I think that's really the big difference. We have two financing mechanisms. The first is sovereign financing for Pacific governments. We'll essentially be looking at offering the same terms as the multilateral development banks. So that means mostly lending for some of the sort of relatively larger, richer Pacific countries like PNG, but also like Fiji or Timor or Palau. And we'll be looking at mostly grants for the smaller Pacific countries, the small Micronesian countries, Kiribati, Nauru, but also Tonga, Tuvalu, as well, to avoid further debt distress in those countries. We also do have a capacity to lend directly to private firms who are investing in infrastructure projects around the Pacific. I'll come back to that later, but essentially what we can offer is broadly commercial terms for commercially viable investments. We are keen to work with the commercial banks in the region, but we can also potentially offer, slightly longer maturities than might be able to be offered commercially, or work with the banks for us to take sort of subordinated or mezzanine debt and to take a slightly greater level of risk than might be available commercially. Building a pipeline has taken some time, given we're very much starting from scratch, but as Ben mentioned, we're very pleased that the government has approved now our first investments for the Tina River transmission line in Solomons, which hopefully will provide Honiara's power for the next 20-30 years. Prime Minister Morrison also advised Prime Minister Marape last month that AFE would be financing the Markham Valley solar project in PNG, and we're expecting sort of further announcements and signing ceremonies for both of these projects over the next month or so. In terms of looking forward, I'm hopeful that AIF might be able to seek approval from the government for as much as 300 million Australian in new investments by the end of this fiscal year. If we're able to do that, and obviously it's still an if, that would make us the second largest infrastructure financier for Pacific governments after the Asian Development Bank. What's coming through the pipeline? I think Prime Minister Morrison previously committed Australia to providing up to 250 million for PNG's ambitious electrification program. And I think Markham Valley is very much likely to be the first in a series of announcements over the next 6 to 12 months in that area. I think PNG, consistent with their Connect PNG agenda, has indicated great interest in seeking Australian financing for road investments, both to help with maintenance and fast dispersing sort of response to the COVID pandemic, but also I think to assist PNG with some of their nation-building investments, potentially the elements of the Trans-Island Highway. I think Prime Minister Morrison's also previously indicated Australia's willingness to work with Timor-Leste to build an undersea ICT cable. Timor is currently the only country in the Pacific now without a cable either in place or underway. And I'm hoping you'll also see announcements before the end of this calendar year about potential Australian support with Japan and the United States to help Palau connect to a new Trans-Pacific ICT cable. For all of these investments, I'd expect procurement would be led by governments, although obviously with us over their shoulder to ensure probity. And I think, as Ben mentioned, the criteria we will particularly be looking for is ensuring high quality contractors and maximising local engagement. I mentioned earlier, AIF can also provide financing to private firms investing in infrastructure projects in the Pacific. I'd stress again, we're looking at broadly commercial terms for broadly commercially viable investments, not grants or subsidised financing. Excuse me just a minute. I'm sorry about that. I think the telecoms revolution across the Pacific over the past decade has shown the scope to attract sort of hundreds of millions of private investment with really transformative effects for the region. We're currently in discussion across the Pacific with a range of firms looking to invest in renewable energy, which I think is a big opportunity given the way many countries, although not yet so much PNG, have opened their generation markets to new private investment. We're in discussions around ports, potentially private telecoms operators, and a hospital PPP in one of the larger countries, just to give you a sense of the sort of areas we're involved in. I think we'd be really open to further discussions with anybody on the audience to this call who is looking to invest in PNG or the region, and we'd be happy to talk further about project specifics. So thank you, True.
Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, gentlemen. We might start out with a couple of questions, but before we do, and please, everyone who's watching, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you do have a question for either Rob or Ben. I was at APEC 2018, Ben, and that was the time when the big rural electrification partnership was announced between Australia, the US, Japan, New Zealand and PNG. To what extent is this program the fulfilment of that pledge that the Australian government made at that meeting, and what else might be following on from it, or is this it?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think the 2018 electrification I was obviously, and many of your participants today, were there as well. Was a driver for some of the approach behind the AIFFP, and during that year and leading up to 2018, the government of the day in PNG was actually requesting Australia to be able to provide bilateral loan finance, to have another tool that they could access for critical infrastructure that goes obviously beyond electrification. So yeah, partly so. The AIFFP though is just one tool for the Australian government. There's a bilateral program has invested pretty heavily in the electrification partnership. We mentioned Markham Valley, but that really is the first of a number of investments that we're currently under negotiation with our counterparts in PNG on. We won't go into detail on this call because they're still being worked through and need to go through approvals, but they are substantive. And we're certainly open to doing further investment in that space as well, in both the public sovereign space as well as commercial private. I think I think probably I'll leave that point that point there. Back to you. Sorry, Andrew, we can't hear you.
So the headline figure for the fund is 2 billion Australian dollars. How fixed is that amount of money, and how flexible? Do you see this potentially becoming a rolling thing, or is that 2 billion a finite amount of money?
Yeah, it's again a good question. It's still early days, but the grant component of the fund is over 5 years. And really, the question around whether it becomes a rolling fund is really a question around how successful we are at commitment and disbursement of the fund. If we're successful, this is new for DFAT, new to the Australian government in this space. So really, the more successful we are at this space, is the greater likelihood of there being being rolled over, but there is no decision to do that at this point.
Our next question is from Andrew Mitchell. Hi Ben and hi Rob. Is there an opportunity within the facility to consider projects working towards digital infrastructure projects for state-owned enterprises and government departments in Papua New Guinea?
Yes.
That's a good one. That's right. Are you able to give a ballpark estimate for the amount of financing for PNG government infrastructure projects that you're looking to provide from now until 2022? That's a very specific question.
Yeah. Rob might want to answer this one. No, I think it's an important point for PNG. It's one of the largest economies with a huge requirement for infrastructure finance. We anticipate a significant amount of the fund would be allocated or absorbed by Papua New Guinea, and much will depend on the pace at which we can agree sensible investment. So a significant majority. But Rob, do you want to add?
No, I think that's right, Ben. At the risk of getting a little out in front and trying to put a number on it, I think we've indicated to the PNG government that should they want, we could be talking in the vicinity of approximately half the fund, if they're able to actually prepare investable projects and work with us to undertake that borrowing in a sensible way.
Can I ask you a question about how you propose working with banks? Would this be a question of you would provide funding to the banks who would then lend it on, or would you be a partner lender in a project?
I think we're open to different mechanisms. The discussions we've had with commercial banks and also with the multilateral banks, is jointly financing investments. One of the attractions I hope that we might be able to bring, particularly when we're looking at private sector investments, is that we are prepared to consider options for longer maturities, to take subordinated or mezzanine debt. And I think that hopefully gives some of the project proponents more opportunities, but it can potentially, I hope, give some of our commercial banking partners some comfort that their investments can be de-risked by us, taking that sort of greater level of risk on our side. So we're open to different mechanisms, but very keen to work with both the commercial and the multilateral banks.
I have a question here from PNG. Is development of housing schemes part of your program? Would you look at housing? And also healthcare, those are two areas.
So look, I think, we are strictly limited legislatively in our mandate to financing infrastructure. We work through Export Finance Australia, as Ben said, and the EFA Act limits our engagement to overseas infrastructure development. I think particularly with the COVID pandemic, there's been a willingness to look a little more flexibly at what might fall into that definition. But I think we're still exploring with our board and our government where the parameters are. Certainly we've been having a discussion, and I think strong support from government about potential investments in health infrastructure. Housing, I think, is one we have not yet been able to test. I think we're open to a further discussion, but I think we would need to test a little bit whether that's in or outside the mandate. And again, I'd stress, we would be looking very much at the commercial financing. If this was, just straight property development, I think it would probably be a hard sell. But if there are other aspects to this, such as social housing or investments, then it may be something we could consider further. So I think that's a long way of saying happy to have a discussion, still testing the exact boundaries of the mandate.
Just a question about the kind of projects. Obviously, electrification is one of the areas you are very interested in. Are there any types of projects that you would not want to pursue? For example, there's been some proposals for coal power in Papua New Guinea in recent years. Is that the kind of project you would look at, or are there things that you are ruling in or ruling out for matters other than purely financial?
I think the first principle is that this is about a conversation primarily on the large-scale sovereign capex financing. It is what are the priorities of the government? Has it fit within economic and essentially an economic development set of criteria? And then does it make sense for us as the financiers, or part financiers, to be involved practically? There are certainly compliance and policy issues that we need to adhere to, just as part of Commonwealth government here. So we do need to comply with issues around environmental protection. We do have policies that relate to climate change. There is a strong what we call a window within the fund around climate change investments, so clean energy projects. But really, the first point is a conversation with government about priorities and working back from there. And as long as it fits with our Commonwealth legislation and EFA lending legislation, then we can assess that and provide advice to our government on whether it is appropriate or not.
Okay. A final question for you both, and that is, if people are interested, having seen your presentation this morning, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, we're very open to having conversations, especially where there's private commercial projects. Rob, team leads on that side. We can certainly send contact details to you as part of the video, so we can send out an email address and contact details for further discussions, and we're certainly open for business and interested in any proposals that your participants might want to raise with us.
Gentlemen, we might leave it there. I realise it's very early days for you, and I hope very much that we'll be able to come back to you and maybe towards the end of the year, and there'll be some really some hard projects we can be talking about as well. But for the moment, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, our thanks to Benedict, David and Rob Jauncey for their time today. Next, we're going to turn to David Hill, the PNG Country Director for the Asian Development Bank. I caught up with David recently in quarantine in Brisbane to get an update on the ADB's significant support for PNG infrastructure. But first, I asked him what support the bank is extending to PNG in terms of urgent budget support this year and also support for COVID-19 pandemic mitigation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Andrew. Well, this year, we basically have three instruments that we're preparing to support the government. First, we're preparing the Health Services Support Development Program, Subprogram 3, which is a policy-based loan. And this has been running now. This is its third year. This is the third and final year of this program. What this program has done, this program was designed and launched in 2018, and it was a hybrid project PBL where we have approximately about $100 million that is building the community health clinics and some district hospitals, building on our previous rural primary health program. And then we married that with a policy-based loan for the potential of $300 million, $100 million each year. And in 2018, we gave $100 million. And then in 2019, we did the same thing. This is budget support, essentially, in exchange for reforms in the health services sector. And this is concentrating on the expenditure side of the ledger. And this year it was supposed to be $100 million as well, and this would be the final subprogram. But we've increased that by 50 million to 150 million for this last subprogram.
That's for US. That's US dollars.
Yes, US dollars. And that one is just about complete in terms of the project processing, meaning the policy actions have all been accomplished by the government in conjunction with ADB support to help them achieve those policy actions. And we are just waiting on final agreement of the Memorandum of Understanding and a few verification that those policy actions have been completed. And then it comes back to us, and then it's all of our internal review process is part of the internal approval process. But I expect this to happen shortly, and I expect this money to be available in October for the government. And I think that would be a great assistance to the government in this period of financial fiscal issues, as well as supporting its response to COVID-19.
Is there any other direct support the ADB is providing this year? Extraordinary support, I guess, additional contributions that might.
Yeah. So we also, based on Prime Minister Marape's request of July 2019, we started preparation of another policy-based loan focused on SOE reforms. Now, this is going to be another policy-based loan program for over 3 years for $500 million. And this is the first sub-program this year. So this one would run 2020, 2021, and 2022. That's the idea. And this year, it's scheduled to be $100 million. And again, it's a policy-based loan. So when the policy actions are agreed upon and achieved in our policy matrix, and then verified, then we can move it forward in our own internal processes. Now, this one, currently, as we speak here in the last week of August, we don't have quite yet all of the policy actions achieved. We're missing a couple. And so this is holding things back, but we're expecting progress on this either by the end of this week or indeed next week, but we're running out of time. And these are some policy actions that have to do with the reform of SOEs to make them more competitive and to make it the whole business environment more enabling for the private sector and more transparent and more accountable in terms of how the SOEs perform in their service provision and indeed bring returns to the government, since the government is the principal shareholder for these SOEs.
So with that, David, just drilling down a little bit on that particular funding, the government has announced a plan to reform the SOEs. There hasn't been a lot of detail in that plan so far, but how would this money support that plan? Is it actually technical support, or is it funding for them to try new things, or even to build or invest in particular projects?
All of the above. When the project is approved, then the policy matrix can be shared with the public.
Yeah. And
the policy matrix will specify the sub-program 1 policy actions that are being worked on now.
Yep.
And it will also outline the policy actions for sub-programs 2 and 3 in the 2 future years. But essentially what the policy actions are about increasing the transparency and accountability in terms of the SOE functions, mm-hmm. including who gets appointed to SOE boards of directors. It's also revising regulations concerning the PPP Act and the Competition Act. And indeed, as we move forward, I expect that it will, and it's also, I'm sorry, another one is important, is the Kch Act. As we move forward, we expect that there'll be a greater focus on particular SOEs to try to support improvements in their business operations. Mm. And indeed, that could end up include the selling of assets and increasing private sector participation with the SOE. This doesn't necessarily mean full privatization, but moving in that direction to bring in the private sector and support efficiency gains in operations and indeed try to enable these SOEs or reformed entities to provide a positive return to the government's yes. coffers rather than a drain on their resources.
Yeah. I should just, for our audience's sake, clarify that KCH is Kumul Consolidated Holdings, which is the holding company for most of the state-owned enterprises, including companies like PNG Power and Air Niugini and post PNG. David,
and Andrew, can I just add one thing? Is yes. that we are not actually drafting any new legislation, but we are actually supporting amendments to existing legislation and operationalism of those existing legislations. They've been approved before, but they haven't been acted upon as per their designs.
Yes.
So we're actually supporting the implementation and maybe some refinements of existing legislation that has already been approved. So it's nothing terribly new, but it is more about trying to make what was agreed upon in, say, 2014 or 2016, more, in operation and implemented as was planned and designed. But for one reason or another, currently hasn't been.
Yep.
And again, this will support competition, transparency, and accountability. We're in the process of getting across the line this year, and that is a specific COVID-19 mitigation and counter-cyclical support. Right. Now PNG, given its population, its GDP, and other factors, is eligible for up to $250 million. And that's what we're working towards. Now, in this instance, there are no policy actions. This is more about the ADB team in the field working with the government to tell the narrative of, okay, if we're going to give this $250 million to the government, how are they going to use it based on their policies to mitigate COVID-19 effects, whether it's the health effects or the counter-cyclical economic effects. And then when this money arrives, then how is it going to be dispersed? What are the transmission mechanisms? And how are we going to measure the effects of how this money got spent? Mm-hmm. And so this is something the ADB is working on in mostly internally, but in close collaboration with Treasury, the UN cluster agencies, DFAT, and the government's Department of Health. And we hope to get this across the line in November.
Yep.
And it'll be very much like budget support in that, it's if and when it gets approved, it doesn't go to contractors or consultants as per our typical infrastructure projects. It goes to the government's budget, and for them to spend on their plans to mitigate COVID-19.
Just to clarify, David, this is a loan rather than a grant?
Correct. It is a loan under the ADB's framework, and PNG is classified in terms of only being able to receive loans. But it is, what we would call concessional by our standards. Is quite inexpensive as compared with what a commercial loan would be.
So the money still needs to be paid back at some stage in the future, though?
At some stage, yes, it does.
Yeah. Excellent. Are we okay to go on to maybe the other areas of infrastructure?
Sure. So with the infrastructure program, we did achieve a success story this year. We working with the Department of Works and with the Treasury, we have approved our project readiness facility, and this is for $31 million.
Yep. And
it is again a loan. And but this facility is a relatively a new instrument for ADB. In the past, we have technical assistance, and we offer that to our clients, our government agencies that we work with, to help prepare projects that are in demand. But often is the case, particularly with the infrastructure projects, there isn't enough technical assistance in terms of the financial support or the time to do the detailed engineering design of roads, ports, airports. And often then after the project is approved, there is some delay between the approval and then the major procurement actions and disbursements the funding and indeed then of the construction of the works.
Hmm.
And so this new facility, what it does is it puts all of that due diligence work and detailed engineering design up front. And so what we have done now is, so there's a $31 million facility that is going to look at ports and key strategic roads. And these consultants will be hired jointly by the Department of Works and ADB through competitive processes. And they will undertake the detailed engineering design. And then when that design is done, then we go back and we decide, okay, for this road, are we going to do a MFF or are we going to do a standalone project? But essentially what we have in mind is that this PRF is going to prepare 2 or 3 MFFs, which will finance the strategic roads of PNG for the next 10 to 15 years.
So, David, I might, while we're talking about roads, with your permission, I might just share a map of PNG which has been provided to us by the Department of Works, which shows the road network. And maybe you could talk about, I know one of the, some of the projects, the road projects the ADB is supporting. Is that all right?
Sure.
Excellent. So let me just get that up on screen. So I understand one of the key projects that's being looked at is a road that will connect the north and south coast of PNG together. So we actually connect Lae to Port Moresby. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. And
what route would that be following? Do we not know? Is it too early to say?
Well, the precise alignment is not clear, but I think this has been studied before, and I think we have an idea of the general alignment. And I think you've. Well, I don't know if that one is on here. I can't quite see it.
Yeah, there's some highlighting. They'll do some highlighting on this map because they've animated it for us.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah.
So these are all the projects the Department of Works has in its forward planning.
Yes.
Under the National Road Strategy, which was released last year. And so it looks like there's 2 possibilities there. One would be to go from Lae via Popondetta across and then up to Port Moresby, or the other one, which is probably going to be quicker, which is going across from Lae to northern part of Central Province and then down the coast road past the LNG plant to Port Moresby.
Yes, and I mean we will look at both routes and decide which is the most feasible one. A key aspect of doing this particular road is going to be the land acquisition.
Yes.
Since it is, parts of it are going to be a new alignment, and that will indeed have to be sorted out in the first instance. Okay. Additionally, we'll be looking at doing the northern coastal road from Jayapura across the coast there by Vanimo and continuing on. The length of that intervention will depend on, again, what is technologically feasible.
Yes.
There are a number of large river crossings up there, and so we'll have to take a look at that. But the idea would be to make the strategic areas around Wewak and Vanimo better connected, and indeed see if we can connect across into Indonesia there at Jayapura. And additionally, in the Highlands region, we would like to expand the Highlands Highway west from Mount Hagen, and then those feeder roads in that region into the Highlands Highway.
Are these all tied into your 10-year funding for the highway, or is this an additional?
No, this is
funding?
this is different. The 10-year Highlands Highway is just for the 430 kilometers from Lae to Mount Hagen.
Right.
So going west from Mount Hagen, this would be additional to that. But there seems to be great demand to continue the Highlands Highway west. Concerning the Highlands Highway, I just figured I would mention it. So we are making progress on Tranche 1 despite some delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
Why are we having delays? Well, some of the contractors, their staff haven't been allowed back in the country, or indeed are not in the country because they're stuck overseas elsewhere. But we are making progress on it. I think all the detailed designs are complete. All the contracts have been awarded, and so Tranche 1 is moving, although a little bit slower than we expected. And then with regard to Tranche 2, the Tranche 1 consultants have prepared the detailed engineering designs for Tranche 2, which is the 71 bridges. And indeed, either today or tomorrow, we expect the 3 civil works packages and 2 consultant packages to be offered to the market. And in this case, so Tranche 2 hasn't been approved yet, but given these uncertain times, what has been agreed between ADB management and the government is we will proceed with the procurement.
Yes.
We'll see what kind of response we get from the market. And concurrently, we will do all the documentation. Well, in fact, it's already done. That is required for approval of the financing. So in a few months' time, say at the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021, assuming that we get those contracts awarded, then ADB will approve the funding.
Right.
Based on lessons learned, we don't want to approve the funding and then not have any contracts. What I was just discussing about why we have the PRF is to get all the design work and all the procurement done so the projects are more efficiently implemented. So this is the idea here on Tranche 2 of the Highlands Highway, where we had a little bit of delay, about 8 to 12 months on the first tranche, and we're trying to avoid doing that again. So we've got the designs done, all the documentation for approving the loans are done. Now we just need to see if during these uncertain times we're going to get response from interested parties for the 2 consultant packages and the 3 civil works packages.
Just on the procurement side of things, how is the procurement being managed for those people who might be watching this going, oh, I wouldn't mind a bit of that project, or I've got something I could offer to that project? How will the procurement be managed?
Well, actually, this is a good question because there's often things that I see in social media or the press about ADB's contract awards. I think I've mentioned this previously at some of the investment conferences. ADB doesn't do the contract awards. We don't undertake the contract awards. The contract awards, the procurement actions, and the contract awards are undertaken by the executing agency, which is in this case the Department of Works. Now they undertake the procurement, but it is done under our supervision or our guidance, and in which we ensure that proper steps with regard to transparency and accountability, and indeed our processes are followed. And so we continue on with that approach. Anyway, we'll see how we go this time around with in terms of the market response given the COVID-19 situation. However, for Tranche 2 of the Highlands Highway, I would say that the procurement documentation is in much better quality than it was in the case of Tranche 1.
Right.
So that there's less uncertainty about what the job is, what the tasks are, and what the costs are expected to be. Because in this case, we have the detailed engineering design completed, full completion. So,
is there any consideration, David, for national participation in projects, or is that entirely up to the Department of Works according to their own policies?
It's not entirely up to them. It's also part of ADB's systems. Given when we have contracts of a certain size, if it is above a certain ceiling, then it needs to be international competitive bidding. If it is below that ceiling, then it can be national competitive bidding. Now, that said, we really would like to see the growth of the national consultant and contractor industry in PNG.
Yes.
We would really like to see that, because that creates jobs, and it keeps the money in the country, as well as it fosters maintenance, because in downstream, we're not going to call in international contractors and consultants to do the maintenance of these assets. We would like to see domestic national consultants and contractors maintain these assets properly to ensure their full design life.
If the guys fly in and build it and then fly out, then the maintenance is very difficult, right?
That's right. That's right. And so what we would really like to see is international consultants and contractors come in, and they work closely with domestic firms. And we're having a little success on that, but there's a lot of room to grow in this sector. But ADB and the World Bank and others are aligned in that we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner, though, and say 55% of this contract has to go to national firms versus international firms. It's just against our principles of how we function with our procurement practices. But however, we would like to see domestic PNG firms get as much of the work as possible. If they were qualified, if they're there, they have the capability, the experience, the means, they can compete as international competitive bidders. There's nothing to stop a domestic firm for putting in a bid for an international competitive bid competition. It's just whether they have the right criteria, they meet the certain thresholds in terms of financial ability, experience, and other resources. So if there was a very large firm or firms in PNG to undertake these works, then that would be fantastic. There is economies of scale. So we don't want to divide up a 430 kilometer road into 43 10-kilometer sections. Right? But we are basically, for our health program, our health sector services development program, the project aspect of it, the community health clinics are all being constructed by national PNG firms.
That's great.
It is good, and it's working very well.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. David, there are some other areas of infrastructure where the ADB has traditionally supported. Transportation, of course, we've talked about with the roads. Energy is another, and possibly even telecommunications. I don't know whether you want to go into telecommunications necessarily, but the power sector, your involvement in that.
Well, in the power sector, we have 3 projects ongoing, and they're all coming to an end, either this year or next year. So we are looking to design a new project in the power sector, and we're working with PNG Power to that end. But that sector is getting crowded, because as per APEC 2 years ago, there was the $1.7 billion pledge from the 5 nations of Japan, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Papua New Guinea. So it's becoming much more competitive in terms of the development partner financing. So PPL now, I guess they have a choice of which development partner they want to work with. But we are designing a new project in that sector, and we'll see how we go with that.
But will that be related to transmission and distribution, or related to power generation?
Currently, it's focused on transmission and distribution. But it could be expanded to production as well. ADB has actually recently hired a natural gas specialist from Central Asia. Although most development partners would agree we want to try to move away from fossil fuels and to renewables, but we do understand the government has a national strategy to make the most use of its own domestic resources, which includes natural gas.
Yes.
So we'll just have to see how that goes in that space. But indeed, these are also changing times for PNG Power as well. They've been undergoing some reorganization and management changes, and so we'll just have to see what the new management, what directions they see themselves moving, and what their priorities are. A lot of these SOEs, Andrew, are under the pump in terms of financial viability.
Yes.
There's, under the Marape administration, there's been much closer scrutiny on the debt, whether it's the central government's debt or the debt that SOEs have been accumulating. And so whether it's in the airport sector or the water supply and sanitation sector or in the energy sector, there's ongoing discussions between Treasury and the various SOEs on who's going to assume this debt.
Yep.
I mean, eventually it is the people of PNG, but in the near term, I guess the idea is we want to, make sure that the debt that is taken on is effective for addressing the development needs of the people and the government's national economic development plans, and ensuring that the priorities are met. And some of these priorities are well established, say in the transport sector, but in other sectors such as water supply, sanitation, or the energy sector, there's a lot of work that's still going on determining what indeed are those priorities. We know there's a lot of work to do, but there's only so much debt we want to take on at one time, or the government can take on at one time, or the SOE can take on at one time. So given those constraints, then what is the priority sub-project to invest upon?
That's it for all of us today. Our sincere thanks to David Hill for his time. Our thanks again to our sponsor, Westpac PNG. This online briefing has been the latest in an ongoing series, which you can find on our YouTube channel shortly. And if you didn't get your question answered during today's session, don't worry. We'll be sending those on to the speakers today. And as we have done in previous events, we'll hope to have some live, some written questions, written answers submitted to you over the next week or so. To keep in touch with what's going on in PNG's economy and in business there, by all means visit businessadvantagepng.com. On the site, in addition to news, you'll also find our Doing Business in PNG guide, which includes legal and tax guides to PNG, business profiles of every province in the country, and profiles of every major industry sector. Well, that's it for us. Thank you very much for your company this morning. Until next time, stay well and very good fortune to you.